the sky turned silver. On a Tuesday morning in September, the radio stations went silent. The news channels froze. For 17 minutes, nothing moved on Earth except the eyes of 7 billion people looking up. Above the clouds, above the atmosphere, something was happening. Something impossible. Then came the ships. They weren't sleek or beautiful. They were broken. Scarred metal hung from their sides like wounded skin. Some ships trailed smoke. Others had lights flickering on and off like they were struggling to stay alive. They descended slowly, carefully, as if they were afraid of breaking apart in the fall. The largest ship landed in the Nevada desert, near Area 51, which made everyone laugh nervously because someone had finally guessed right. The others landed in designated zones across the world: the Australian outback, the Siberian plains, the Sahara Desert, and several remote ocean platforms that governments had secretly built years ago, just in case. Just in case aliens showed up. Now they had. Commander Sarah Mitchell stood in the underground control room in Nevada, watching screens filled with data she barely understood. She was a military woman, trained for conflict, prepared for threats. But the instruments told her something strange. The ships were not weapons. They were shelters. And inside those shelters were living beings, millions of them, who seemed to be suffering. "What do we do?" asked Lieutenant James Chin, a young man from California who still believed most problems could be solved with communication and optimism. "We wait," Sarah said. "We watch. And we prepare for anything." The first airlock of the largest ship opened at dawn. They emerged slowly. Not as invaders but as survivors. The beings were tall, nearly 8 feet, with smooth grayish skin that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. They had 6 fingers on each hand and eyes that were completely black. Not dark brown but truly black, like looking into space itself. Their bodies were thin, almost fragile, and many of them moved as if even breathing hurt. One figure stepped forward. This being was older, marked by deep scars that ran across their face and down their left arm. The being raised both hands slowly, the universal gesture of non-aggression that somehow transcended galaxies. "I am Kale," the being said in English that sounded like wind through broken glass. "We seek refuge. Our world is gone. Our people are broken. We mean no harm." Sarah Mitchell breathed slowly. This was the most important moment in human history and she was holding it in her hands. She thought of her daughter, asleep in a safe house 200 miles away. She thought of the families watching on television, wondering if this was the end of the world or the beginning of something new. She pressed the communication button. "Welcome to Earth," she said. "You are safe here." The first month was chaos. Governments argued about what to do. Scientists wanted to study the aliens. Military leaders wanted to contain them. Religious groups wanted to pray for them or against them, depending on which group you asked. But gradually a decision emerged. The aliens would stay, at least for now. They would be housed in designated enclaves, large, carefully designed communities where they could be protected and monitored while they figured out what came next. The human enclave in Northern California became home to approximately 15,000 Kathrani. That was their species name. They came from a planet called Kethra, which had been destroyed in what Earth scientists were calling the Galactic War. For the past 5 years, the Kathrani had been running, hiding, losing their homes, their families, their identity, one planet at a time. Now they were here. And they were broken in ways that couldn't be fixed with food or medicine. Dr. Maria Santos was a psychologist assigned to study the Kathrani's emotional and mental state. What she found disturbed her. The aliens showed almost no emotional response to anything. They were quiet. They ate when food was given to them. They slept in the designated areas. They followed rules. But there was no spark in their eyes. There was no hope. It was like watching people who were physically alive but spiritually dead. "What happened to them?" she asked Kale one afternoon in the observation room. Kale sat completely still for a long time before answering. His English had improved, though it still sounded strange, like a voice recorded underwater. "We lost everything," he said finally. "We lost our homes. We lost our loved ones. We lost our planet. And we lost the reason we were alive in the first place." "What was that reason?" Maria asked gently. Kale turned his completely black eyes toward her. "Purpose. Identity. The things that made us Kathrani. The things that made us all of that is gone. We are only ghosts now." Maria wrote this in her notes, but she didn't know how to help. Therapy didn't work. Medication didn't work. Time didn't seem to be healing anything. The Kathrani were surviving, but they weren't living. It would take something unexpected to change that. The human enclave in Northern California was built near the town of Eureka, a small coastal community with about 26,000 people. The intention was to keep the Kathrani separated from the general human population while they adjusted. But separation was impossible to maintain completely, and small moments of contact began to happen naturally. Thomas Reeves was a street musician. He was 52 years old, had gray in his hair, and played an acoustic guitar that had been with him for 35 years. He had never been famous. He would never be famous. But every evening he sat on the bridge that connected the human town with the edge of the Kathrani enclave, and he played. He played folk songs, blues, jazz standards, and original compositions. He played because it was what made him happy. He played because the world was full of pain, and music was how he fought against it. One evening in November, as the sun turned the sky orange and pink, Thomas was playing a song called The Road Home. It was a song about loss and displacement and the human need to find peace somewhere, anywhere. He didn't notice the Kathrani at first. There were 3 of them standing at the edge of the enclave just watching. They had been standing there for 5 minutes before Thomas realized they were there. He almost stopped playing, but something made him continue. He finished the song and started another one, an old blues piece about heartbreak and survival. One of the Kathrani stepped forward. Her name was Zyra, and she was one of the youngest of their kind, only 37 years old in Kathrani years, which made her about 20 in human years. She was small for her species and had a gentleness about her that stood out even among a traumatized people. Zyra closed her black eyes. And she listened. When Thomas finished playing, Zyra opened her eyes and looked at him. She didn't speak. She just nodded slowly, and then she turned and walked back into the enclave, followed by the other 2. But something had changed in that moment. Something small and quiet, but real. The next evening Zyra came back. And the evening after that she came back again. Within 2 weeks, there were 20 Kathrani standing at the edge of the enclave each evening, listening to Thomas play. Within a month there were 100. Thomas didn't ask questions. He just played. Sarah Mitchell, the commander who had first welcomed the Kathrani to Earth, was walking through the enclave with Cale one afternoon when she noticed the change. It was subtle, but it was there. The Kathrani were still quiet, still reserved, but their eyes were different. There was something in them that hadn't been there before. Something has changed, she said to Cale. Cale smiled. It was the first time Sarah had ever seen him smile. Yes, he said. There is a human. He plays music on the bridge. The sound reaches us. And in that sound we hear something. What do you hear? Sarah asked. Understanding, Cale said. Sadness that we recognize. Joy that we remember. He is telling our story without knowing our story. Is this what humans call art? Sarah didn't have an answer, but she decided to find out. That evening she went to the bridge and listened to Thomas play. She watched the Kathrani. Their eyes were moving slightly. Their bodies were relaxed in a way she hadn't seen before. And when Thomas played a particularly moving passage, she could have sworn she saw tears in the black eyes of some of the aliens. The next day she arranged a meeting with the cultural representatives of the enclave. She brought in not just Thomas, but other artists from the human community. There was Maria Chin, a visual artist who painted bold, emotional pieces. There was David Washington, a writer who told stories about human struggles and human strength. There was Elena Rossi, a dancer who moved like water, expressing emotions without words. What we're proposing, Sarah explained, is a structured cultural exchange. Human artists will be invited to share their work with the Kathrani. We'll see if this helps with their psychological recovery. The scientists in the room looked skeptical. But the evidence was there. The Kathrani were responding to art in ways they weren't responding to anything else. Within a week, the first official cultural event was organized. Thomas played for an hour. Maria displayed her paintings. David read from his novel. Elena danced to a recorded composition. And the Kathrani watched. They watched with complete attention, with what looked almost like hunger. When it was over, Cale approached Thomas and extended his 6-fingered hand. Thank you, he said. You have given us something we thought was lost forever. You have given us feeling. Something shifted in the enclave after that first official event. The change was gradual, but it was undeniable. The Kathrani started to engage. They started to ask questions. And most importantly, they started to create. Zyra was the first to try. She came to Maria Chen's art studio, a space that had been set up specifically for this cultural exchange, carrying pieces of charcoal and paper. She had never drawn before. She had no training, no experience. But she had something else. She had emotion. She had memory. She had pain that needed to come out. What Zyra drew was haunting. It was an image of a planet, her planet, but it was fractured, broken, falling apart. The lines were jagged and desperate. The shading was dark, almost violent. But there was also something else in the image. Light breaking through the fractures. Hope maybe. Or simply the refusal to surrender to despair. Maria looked at the drawing and cried. Not because of the sadness in it, but because of the truth in it. This is beautiful, Maria said. You have real talent. Zaira looked at her drawing as if seeing it for the first time. I have never made anything before, she said. On Kethra we had artists, but I was not one of them. I had another purpose. But now I think I need this. Within days, dozens of Kethrani were in the art studio. Some were painting. Some were drawing. Some were working with clay and sculpture. Each piece was different, but they all carried the same raw emotion, the pain of loss mixed with the strange beauty of survival. Kale surprised everyone by showing interest in music. He didn't have the physical structure to play human instruments, but he started working with David Washington on something new, combining the Kethrani language with human musical compositions. The result was extraordinary. The Kethrani language had a musical quality to it, a rhythm and flow that could harmonize with traditional earth instruments in unexpected ways. Thomas Reeves found himself working with a Kethrani named Tor, who had an instinctive understanding of melody. Together they created hybrid songs that sounded like nothing anyone had ever heard before, alien and familiar at the same time, sad and hopeful simultaneously. Elena the dancer began teaching movement to a group of Kethrani. Their tall, thin bodies were naturally graceful, and when they learned to use that grace to express emotion rather than just exist in space, they became mesmerizing. Human and Kethrani bodies dancing together looked like a conversation between two different languages finding a way to speak to each other. In just 2 months, the cultural exchange had transformed from a scientific experiment into a genuine creative explosion. 3 months into the cultural exchange, something happened that none of the scientists or government officials expected. The Kethrani didn't just become participants in human art. They became innovators. They started creating entirely new forms of art that had never existed before. One morning, Cale approached Sarah Mitchell with a proposal. We wish to tell our story, he said. But we wish to tell it in a way that humans will understand. We wish to create a narrative that blends our music, our visual art, our movement, and our words. Would this be possible? What Cale was describing was essentially a new art form, something between theater, opera, visual art, and storytelling. It would take the collective talents of both humans and Kethrani to create it. Tell me what you need, Sarah said, and we'll make it happen. Over the next 6 weeks, something remarkable took shape. The artistic community of the Enclave, now numbering nearly 200 humans and 500 Kethrani, began working on what they called the story of the star that fell. It was the story of Kethra, told not as a tragedy, but as a transformation. The story was performed on a stage that had been specially built in the central plaza of the Enclave. The performance lasted 3 hours. It opened with Kethrani musicians playing an original composition that sounded like the birth of stars. Then Zaira's visual art was projected onto the stage, paintings and drawings that showed Kethra as it once was, beautiful, advanced, full of life and promise. Then came the heartbreak. Dancers, human and Kethrani moving together, portrayed the attack, the destruction, the desperate flight. It was visceral and devastating. There wasn't a dry eye in the audience. But the performance didn't end in despair. As the destruction reached its peak, new music emerged. Human instruments joined with Kethrani voices. And gradually the tone shifted. The dancers began to move differently, not in panic anymore but in searching. In hoping. In building something new. The final scene showed human and Kethrani artists side by side, creating, painting, playing music, dancing, building. When the performance ended, the audience, thousands of humans and Kethrani, stood in complete silence for nearly a minute. Then they began to applaud. The Kethrani, having learned this gesture from humans, clapped their 6-fingered hands together. The sound was different from human applause, more like rain on metal, but it was applause nonetheless. Cale stood on the stage, tears streaming down his alien face, and said something that would be quoted around the world. We came to Earth expecting to find shelter. What we found was ourselves. News of the cultural exchange and the story of the star that fell spread quickly. First across Earth, then across the solar system through the various communication networks, and eventually across the known galaxy. Other alien civilizations learned about what was happening in the human enclave in Northern California. Some were skeptical. Some were dismissive. But others were curious. And some were desperate. Within 6 months, there were similar enclaves being established in other parts of the world. Artists from a dozen different human cultures were invited to work with the Kathrani. The exchange became richer, more complex, more surprising. A traditional Japanese musician found ways to harmonize with Kathrani composers. A Nigerian sculptor discovered that the Kathrani understanding of form was fundamentally different from human understanding, and the fusion created something neither culture could have made alone. But the real surprise came from beyond Earth. A delegation from a species called the Valorians, who had been at war with the Kathrani before the galactic conflict destroyed both their civilizations, requested to come to Earth. They wanted to participate in the cultural exchange. They wanted to create art with the beings they had once fought against. The first time a Valorian, a crystalline being of pure energy contained in a biomechanical suit, stood on the stage in the human enclave, everyone held their breath. Would the old wounds resurface? Would violence break out? Instead, a Valorian named Crystalline approached Kale. And together they composed a piece of music that told the story of their conflict and their healing. The Valorians' music was purely electronic, mathematical in its precision. But when layered with the organic, flowing music of the Kathrani, it created something transcendent. The world watched, and the galaxy watched, as former enemies created art together. 1 year after the first Kathrani ship landed on Earth, Sarah Mitchell stood in her office reviewing reports. The statistics were extraordinary. Psychological recovery among the Kathrani was at 92%. Suicide rates had dropped to nearly zero. Engagement in creative activities was universal. But more importantly, something had shifted in their very understanding of what it meant to be alive. She received a video message from Kale. In it, he sat in an art studio surrounded by paintings and sculptures. Some by Kathrani, some by humans, some collaborative pieces that belonged to no single species. "Commander Mitchell," Kale said, "I wish to share something with you. When we arrived on Earth, we believed our people were broken beyond repair. We believed that the loss of our planet meant the loss of our souls. But we were wrong. Our souls were not lost. They were simply waiting to be expressed in a new way. On Kethra we had art, yes, but it was formal, restrained, bound by tradition and expectation. Here we have learned that art is not about perfection or tradition. Art is about truth. It is about taking what is inside you, the pain, the hope, the confusion, the wonder, and making it real in the world. This act of creation, this fundamental human capacity that you possess, it is not a luxury. It is not a decoration on the side of survival. It is survival itself. It is the thing that makes us more than simply alive. It makes us alive in the way that matters. We came to Earth as refugees. We leave this year as artists. And we have learned that these two things, being broken and being creative, are not opposites. They are partners in the dance of becoming human." Sarah watched the message 3 times. The third time she cried. That evening she attended the second annual performance of The Story of the Star That Fell, which had been updated and expanded and now included the arrival on Earth, the discovery of human creativity, and the healing that had followed. After the performance, she was invited to say a few words to the assembled crowd of humans and Kathrani. She stood on the stage, looking out at thousands of faces. Some human, some alien, all of them focused on her with genuine attention and hope. "I was trained to protect people through weapons and strategy," she said. "But tonight I learned that there is a more powerful form of protection. It is the protection of being seen and understood. It is the protection of having your pain acknowledged and transformed into something beautiful. Every person in this room, human or Kathrani or any other species, deserves to have their truth heard. Deserves to have their story told. Deserves to have their creativity celebrated. This is what makes us strong. Not our weapons. Not our technology. But our capacity to create, to connect, and to transform suffering into art." 5 years after the Kathrani arrived on Earth, the human enclave in Northern California looked completely different from what it had been in those early months. It was no longer separate from the human community. The boundaries had dissolved. Humans and Kathrani lived together, worked together, created together. The original group of artists, Thomas Reeves, Maria Chin, David Washington, and Elena Rossi, had become elders of a vast artistic community. Students of every species came to learn from them. New art forms had been created. New styles of music had emerged. New stories had been told. The Kathrani had stopped being refugees. They had become citizens. They had become artists. They had become members of Earth's family. But perhaps more importantly, something had shifted in the wider galaxy. Other species that had suffered in various conflicts began to send delegations to Earth. They came to learn what the Kathrani had learned, that creativity was a form of healing that no amount of therapy or resources could replicate. artists from dozens of worlds began to gather in the human enclave. Each brought their unique perspective, their unique capacity for creating beauty. And the art that resulted, music that sounded like nothing anyone had ever heard before, visual art that showed beauty in ways that stretched the definition of the word, stories that contained truths from across the galaxy, became a universal language. 10 years after the Kathrani arrival, the United Earth government established the Interstellar Arts and Healing Initiative. Its mission was to bring together artists from across the galaxy to create collaborative works that could heal trauma, build understanding, and forge connections between peoples who had been at war. Cale became the director of the initiative. He worked with artists and healers and scientists to develop new approaches to trauma recovery through creative expression. His research showed that the human brain, and the brains of most sentient species regardless of their biology, responded to art in ways that were neurologically similar to meditation, therapy, and even advanced medicine. Art wasn't replacing healing. It was becoming part of the essential toolkit of healing. Thomas Reeves, now in his 60s, recorded an album called Songs for the Stars. It featured his original compositions alongside music created by Kathrani, Valorians, and several other species. The album became the first truly intergalactic bestseller, downloaded and listened to by beings across the known universe. Maria Chen's paintings were displayed in galleries on 3 different planets. Her series Fractures of Light, showing broken worlds slowly being mended through creative expression, became iconic. Young artists of all species studied her work and tried to understand how she captured something so universal. David Washington wrote a novel called The Refugee's Song that told the complete story of the first year of the Kathrani arrival on Earth, but from multiple perspectives: human perspectives, Kathrani perspectives, and the perspective of Earth itself, somehow made conscious and aware. The novel won every major literary award in human civilization and became required reading in schools across the galaxy. Elena's dance company became multicultural, then multi-species. Her choreography, which had once moved only human bodies, now choreographed the movement of beings with completely different anatomies. A Valorian energy being dancing alongside a human dancer, moving to music created by a Kathrani composer and a human musician. This became normal. This became beautiful. This became proof that difference was not something to fear, but something to celebrate. On the 10th anniversary of the Kathrani arrival, a massive celebration was held in the human enclave. It was attended by government leaders from 100 worlds, artists from 50 species, refugees of different conflicts who had come to learn from the Kathrani experience, and ordinary people, human and alien alike, who had been changed by the art created in those years. Cale stood on the stage where The Story of the Star That Fell had first been performed. He was older now, visibly aged by the leadership and responsibility he had taken on. But his eyes were bright, alive, full of purpose. 10 years ago, he said, my people arrived on Earth as ghosts. We had lost everything that made us who we were. We came expecting to find shelter. We came expecting to survive. But we found something far more valuable than survival. We found the reason to survive. We found the reason to live. That reason is this: every being in this galaxy has within them an infinite capacity to create, to make beauty, to tell truth, to transform pain into something meaningful. We thought this capacity was something only the privileged could pursue. We thought it was a luxury for those who had already secured their basic needs. But we were wrong. The need to create is as fundamental as the need to breathe. And when a people are allowed to create, when they are given the space and the encouragement and the community to express their truth through art, they do not just survive. They transcend. They become more than they were. They become what they were always meant to be. This is the true power of human creativity. It is not decoration. It is not entertainment. It is the force that rebuilds civilizations. It is the force that heals wounds that no weapon can cause. It is the bridge that connects us across species, across culture, across time itself. We came to Earth broken. We are leaving Earth whole. Not because our wounds have disappeared, but because we have learned to transform our wounds into beauty. And in that transformation, we have discovered that we are not broken at all. We are just beginning. The audience, thousands of beings from dozens of species, stood and applauded. The sound was like thunder, like rain, like the music of creation itself. 25 years after the Kathrani arrived on Earth, the galaxy had fundamentally changed. Wars were fewer. Healing was more common. And at the center of this transformation was the simple idea that had emerged from the human enclave in Northern California: that art was not a luxury but a necessity. That creativity was not a decoration on civilization, but the foundation of it. Thomas Reeves died peacefully in his sleep at age 92. He had spent his last decades traveling across the galaxy, playing his guitar for refugee communities of every species. Young musicians, human and alien, carried on his legacy, creating music that blended human folk traditions with the musical languages of a dozen different worlds. The human enclave became known throughout the galaxy as simply the place where healing happens. Artists from across the universe came there to learn, to create, and to understand that their pain could be transformed into something beautiful. Kale lived another 30 years, long enough to see 3 generations of Kathrani who had never known Kethra except through art. He saw children born in human hospitals, raised in multicultural enclaves, who grew up speaking 3 languages and creating art in forms that had never existed before their generation. He saw the impossible become normal. He saw broken people become whole again. On his deathbed, surrounded by artists of every species, Kale whispered a final message: "Tell them that the stars still shine. And as long as we have the courage to create, we will be able to see by their light." His words were recorded, then shared, then echoed across the galaxy. They became the mission statement of the Interstellar Arts Initiative. They became the foundation of a new way of understanding healing, hope, and what it meant to be alive. And it all began with a street musician on a bridge, playing music that nobody asked him to play, for an audience he didn't know was listening. It began with human creativity offered freely, without agenda, without expectation of reward. And it began with beings who were broken enough to understand that being broken was not the end of the story. It was simply the moment before the real story began. The story of transformation. The story of healing. The story of art. The story of becoming human, no matter what species you came from. 30 years after the Kathrani first arrived on Earth, something unexpected happened. Scientists had been working on a project in absolute secrecy for nearly a decade. It was a project so ambitious, so seemingly impossible, that no one dared speak about it openly until the moment it was ready to be unveiled. They had found a way to rebuild Kethra. The discovery came almost by accident. A team of human and Kathrani scientists, working together in a research facility in Switzerland, had been studying the quantum structure of matter itself. They were trying to understand if it was theoretically possible to reconstruct a planet's ecosystem after complete destruction. It was a purely academic exercise at first, a thought experiment about the nature of matter, time, and planetary systems. But then something remarkable occurred. A Kathrani scientist named Vor, who was the daughter of Kale, had a breakthrough. She discovered that if you combined human understanding of molecular biology with Kathrani knowledge of quantum engineering, you could theoretically reverse engineer a destroyed planetary ecosystem. You could take the genetic material that still existed in preserved form, combine it with advanced terraforming technology, and rebuild. It would take decades. It would require resources from multiple worlds. It would be the largest collaborative project in galactic history. But it was possible. When Kale learned of this discovery, he sat in silence for 3 hours. His daughter Vor sat beside him, waiting for his response. She knew this discovery would change everything. For the Kathrani, it represented something they had stopped believing in: home. Finally Kale spoke. "We must tell them," he said. "We must tell all of our people." An assembly was called in the central plaza of the human enclave. By this time, the enclave had grown to include human residents who had chosen to stay, as well as Kathrani who had chosen to build permanent lives on Earth. The boundary between human and Kathrani community had long since disappeared. They were simply neighbors, friends, family. Kale stood on the stage where so many performances had taken place, where so many stories had been told. But this time he was not there to tell a story. He was there to offer a choice. "My people," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 3 decades of leadership, "we have been given something we thought was lost forever. We have been given the possibility of home. Scientists have discovered that Kethra can be rebuilt. Not as it was. We know now that the Kethra of the past had many problems, many conflicts that contributed to our destruction. But rebuilt as it could be. A new Kethra. A Kethra that we will create together with our human friends and our allies across the galaxy." The crowd was silent. Then slowly, emotion began to show on the faces of the Kathrani. Some were crying. Some looked conflicted. Some looked frightened. Kale continued. "But I must be honest with you. This is not a simple return home. This is a choice about what home means. If we return to Kethra, we will return changed. We will return as artists and creators. We will return carrying with us everything we have learned on Earth about healing, about transformation, about what it means to turn pain into beauty. We will return carrying relationships with humans, with Valorians, with beings from a dozen other worlds. We will return and we will rebuild not just a planet but a civilization that understands that creativity is not a luxury but the foundation of everything. He paused, looking out at the crowd. But some of you may choose to stay. And that is also beautiful. That is also right. This Earth has become your home. And we will always be connected across the stars. The decision was not made lightly. Committees were formed. Discussions happened. Some Kathrani wanted to return to their world and begin the reconstruction. Others wanted to stay on Earth. Many wanted to do both, to help rebuild Kethra and then return to Earth, or to split their time between the two worlds. Ultimately, the Kathrani people decided on a hybrid approach. A core group of about 40,000 would return to Kethra to begin the reconstruction process. They would be joined by volunteers from other species, humans, Valorians, and representatives from 12 other civilizations who wanted to be part of this grand project. The remaining Kathrani would stay on Earth, continuing their artistic and cultural work while supporting the reconstruction effort through research, funding, and ongoing collaboration. Vor was chosen to lead the Kethra reconstruction project. She was brilliant, she was respected by both Kathrani and humans, and she was the child of two worlds. Her father Kale represented the past, but Vor represented the future. She had been born during the early years of the cultural exchange, and she had grown up surrounded by human artists and Kathrani healers. She understood both cultures intimately. The project would take 50 years. 50 years of carefully rebuilding ecosystems. 50 years of establishing cities and communities. 50 years of learning how to create a civilization that was fundamentally different from what the Kathrani had built before. And it would all be done through collaboration. The departure of the first wave of Kathrani bound for Kethra happened on a day that would later be called the Day of Two Beginnings. One part of the story was ending, the story of the Kathrani as refugees on Earth. But another story was beginning, the story of the Kathrani as architects of their own destiny. The ships that would carry them to Kethra were different from the broken vessels that had first arrived on Earth. These ships had been built collaboratively, using human technology, Kathrani engineering, and innovations from several other species. They were beautiful ships, designed not just for function but for art. The hulls were decorated with murals that told the story of the Kathrani's time on Earth. The interiors were spaces where Kathrani and human engineers had worked together to create environments that were both practical and beautiful. Thomas Reeves's great-granddaughter, a musician named Sarah Reeveston, named after both her great-grandfather's friend and the original commander of the Enclave, composed a piece of music for the departure. It was performed by a hybrid orchestra of human and Kathrani musicians, and it would later be played on Kethra, becoming the anthem of the reconstruction. The music was called The Bridge to Home, and it told the story of a journey across distance and time, carrying memories and creativity and hope toward a new beginning. Kale stood at the entrance to the main launch facility, watching as the ships prepared for departure. He was 98 years old now, frail by human standards but still carrying the dignity of his entire species' journey. He would not be returning to Kethra. His daughter had asked him to, but Kale had refused. "My place is here," he had told Vor. "My purpose is to maintain the bridge between worlds. To make sure that as you rebuild Kethra, you never forget that you are now part of something larger than just Kethra. You are part of a galaxy that is learning to create together. You are part of a family that includes humans and Valorians and a dozen other species. If I return to Kethra, I might become trapped in the past. But if I stay here, I can keep the vision alive. I can keep reminding people that we are all refugees in some way, and that the answer to refuge is not isolation but connection." Sarah Mitchell, now in her 80s, having retired from military command but still involved in diplomatic efforts, stood beside Kale as they watched the ships. She had lived longer than most humans ever did, and she had lived to see something extraordinary, the transformation of what might have been a cosmic catastrophe into a story of healing and hope. "Do you regret staying?" she asked Kale. He turned to her with his dark, ancient eyes. "Not for a moment. I have had 3 lives. My first life was as a leader on Kethra before the war. My second life was as a refugee, lost and broken. And my third life has been here on Earth as an artist and a healer. If I had returned to Kethra to rebuild the planet, I would have been returning to a version of my first life. But what I have here is something better. I have purpose without the weight of the past. I have work that matters without the burden of being the great leader of my people. I can simply be Kale, an artist, a storyteller, a friend to those around me. And that is enough." The ships launched that evening, carrying the hopes and dreams of 40,000 Kathrani toward their reconstructed homeworld. The launch was broadcast across Earth, across the solar system, and throughout the galaxy. Billions of beings watched as Kathrani and their allies departed on what would be the greatest construction project the universe had ever seen. But what happened after the launch was perhaps even more important than the launch itself. The cultural exchange continued on Earth, but it evolved. With many of the Kathrani now focused on the reconstruction effort on Kethra, the artists who remained on Earth began to think about what it meant to create a new culture. One that was truly integrated between human and Kathrani rather than separated. Maria Chin, now in her 90s but still actively painting, organized what she called the Gallery of All Worlds. It was a massive installation that stretched across several city blocks in the human enclave. The gallery featured not just visual art, but interactive experiences. Visitors could listen to music while looking at paintings while experiencing holographic performances that showed Kathrani dances synchronized with human choreography. The most famous piece in the Gallery of All Worlds was a collaborative work called The Moment of Understanding. It was created by 23 artists from 8 different species over the course of 2 years. The piece was so large it took up an entire building. It told the story of first contact between humans and Kathrani, but it told it from the perspective of every being involved. The fear of the humans, the desperation of the Kathrani, the hope that emerged when 2 species learned to communicate through art. Visitors walked through the piece chronologically, experiencing the emotion of each moment. They heard the anxiety in the music of early contact. They saw the visual representation of fear and confusion. They felt the gradual shift as understanding emerged. And by the end, they emerged into a space of pure joy and light, where multiple art forms blended together in celebration of connection. People cried walking through The Moment of Understanding. It became the most visited art installation in human history. Beings from across the galaxy made pilgrimages to Earth just to experience it. David Washington, the novelist who had documented the early days of the cultural exchange, decided to write a new book. It was called The 25-Year Bridge, and it told the story of how human and Kathrani culture had integrated over the years. Unlike his first novel, which had been written from multiple viewpoints, this novel was written from a single viewpoint, the viewpoint of someone who had experienced both cultures, who had lived between worlds. The protagonist of the novel was a young Kathrani named Lyra who had been born on Earth to a Kathrani mother and human father. The novel followed her journey as she discovered her identity, not as Kathrani or human, but as something new. A being who could speak both languages fluently, who understood both cultures intimately, and who represented the future of the galaxy. The novel became required reading in schools across the human world. Young humans read it to understand Kathrani culture. Young Kathrani read it to understand human culture. But most importantly, everyone read it to understand what the future could be. A future where beings of different species and cultures could create new identities together, blending the best of their traditions. Elena Rossi's dance company became even more experimental. She began working with Valorians, whose energy forms could be visually represented through advanced holographic technology. The dances she choreographed with Valorian partners were unlike anything that had ever existed before, human bodies moving in conversation with pure energy, creating patterns that seemed to defy the laws of physics. One piece, called The Dance of Two Lights, featured Elena herself dancing with a Valorian named Crystalline. The human dancer moved in 3 dimensions, while the Valorian energy being moved in ways that seemed to transcend dimensional space. When they danced together, it looked like matter and energy were having a conversation, finding harmony in their fundamental differences. The piece was performed in the central plaza of the human enclave, and it was broadcast to billions of beings across the galaxy. When Elena and Crystalline finished their dance, they stood together in the center of the stage, one made of flesh and bone, one made of pure energy contained in a biomechanical form. They held their hands together, and in that moment the entire audience understood something profound, that the most beautiful relationships were not between beings who were the same, but between beings who were different enough to teach each other something new. But the real transformation happened when the first results came back from Kethra. 5 years into the reconstruction project, Vor sent a message back to Earth. It was not a written message or a formal report. It was something far more powerful. It was a piece of art. It was a video that showed what was happening on the reconstructed Kethra. The video opened with images of barren land, the aftermath of the destruction, the empty place where the Kathrani world had once been. For several minutes, the video showed nothing but emptiness. It was haunting and deeply sad. But then the music began, a piece that Vor herself had composed, blending Kathrani musical traditions with human musical structures. And the transformation began. Time-lapse sequences showed vegetation beginning to grow. The genetic banks that had been preserved held the seeds of Kathrani plants, species that had existed for thousands of years. As these plants were introduced to the soil, they began to thrive. Green appeared on the barren landscape. And the music shifted, becoming fuller, richer, more hopeful. Then came the cities. Not recreations of the old Kathrani cities, but new cities, designed collaboratively by Kathrani, humans, Valorians, and representatives of other species. The architecture was stunning. It blended Kathrani geometric precision with human organic design. It incorporated Valorian energy-efficient systems and innovations from species whose names most humans couldn't pronounce. But what was most striking about the new cities was that they were designed around art. The buildings themselves were art. The streets were galleries. The public squares were performance spaces. The entire civilization was being built with the understanding that creativity was not something separate from daily life. It was the foundation of daily life. The video showed Kathrani and humans and Valorians and beings from a dozen other species working together. They were building. They were creating. They were laughing together. And the music, the Kathrani composition, swelled to a crescendo that was so beautiful that everyone watching wept. At the end of the video, Vor appeared. She was standing on a hillside overlooking the reconstructed Kethra, and behind her was a sunrise, the sun rising over a world that had been dead and was now alive again. "Greetings to all the people of Earth," Vor said, her voice carrying the accent of someone who had been raised between two worlds. "I am Vor, daughter of Kale, leader of the Kethra Reconstruction Project. I want to share with you what we have learned in these 5 years of rebuilding. When we first arrived on this empty world, we carried with us the old blueprints for Kethra. We had the scientific knowledge to recreate the planet as it had been. We could have done that. We could have simply rebuilt the past. But we chose differently. We chose to rebuild the future instead. We brought with us the lessons we learned on Earth. We brought artists and musicians and storytellers. We brought engineers who had learned to think creatively. We brought the understanding that a civilization is not strong because of its weapons or its technology, but because of its capacity to create meaning and beauty. Kethra is being rebuilt as an artistic civilization. Every building is designed not just for function but for beauty. Every city incorporates spaces for performance and creation. Every community has artists and creators at its heart, not as luxury but as necessity. And something remarkable is happening. As we rebuild Kethra, we are healing. The trauma of losing our world, the pain of being refugees, the despair we felt when we thought our civilization was gone forever, all of that is being transformed through creation. We are literally building our healing into the foundation of our new world. And we want to invite you, all of you across the galaxy, to come see what we are creating. Come bring your art. Come bring your music. Come bring your stories. Come help us build a civilization that proves that the most powerful force in the universe is not weapons or conquest or dominance. It is creativity. It is the capacity to take what is broken and transform it into something beautiful. We are no longer refugees. But we remember what it felt like to be refugees. And we have built that memory into our civilization as a reminder that all beings, no matter where they come from, deserve the chance to create, to heal, and to find purpose through art. This is the future we are building. And we invite you to be part of it. The message ended, and for a long moment, there was silence throughout Earth. Then, gradually, people began to understand the full meaning of what Vor had said. The Kathrani had not just rebuilt their world. They had created a new model for civilization. A model that put art and creativity at the center. A model that understood that healing and creation were not separate processes but two parts of the same journey. Within a year, the first volunteers began arriving on Kethra. Not soldiers or scientists or politicians but artists, painters and musicians and dancers and writers and sculptors and performers of every kind. They came from Earth and from a dozen other worlds, all wanting to be part of the greatest collaborative art project in galactic history. The human enclave in Northern California became what was known as the Seed Enclave, the original model that all other cultural centers across the galaxy would be based on. Young artists came to Earth not just to create, but to learn the history of the Kathrani transformation. They walked the bridge where Thomas Reeves had first played music for the refugees. They visited the art studio where Zyra had drawn her first painting. They watched performances of The Story of the Star That Fell, in the plaza where it had first been performed. And they understood that they were part of something larger than themselves. They understood that every act of creation was both personal healing and contribution to a galactic healing. Kale lived to be 107 years old. He spent his final years as what the community called the Keeper of Memory. He would sit in parks and tell stories to anyone who would listen. He would speak about what it had been like to arrive on Earth as a broken, desperate refugee. He would describe the first moment he heard Thomas Reeves play music. He would talk about the slow, miraculous process of rediscovering hope through art. Young Kathrani who had been born on Earth and would never know their original world would sit at Kale's feet and listen. Humans who had never experienced the refugee enclave would listen. Beings from other species who had never suffered displacement would listen. And all of them would understand something that Kale never had to state explicitly, that their stories mattered, that their pain mattered, and that their capacity to transform that pain into beauty was perhaps the most important thing any being could do. When Kale died, his funeral became an international event, attended by leaders and artists from across the galaxy. The entire human enclave gathered, along with thousands of Kathrani who had returned from Kethra to pay their respects. And instead of a traditional funeral, they performed. Every artist who had worked with Kale, directly or indirectly, contributed something. Thomas Reeves's great-great-granddaughter played a piece on the same guitar that her ancestor had played on the bridge 30 years before. Maria Chen's artistic legacy was shown through a gallery of work that had been created over the decades in her studio. David Washington's novels were read by actors of multiple species. Elena Rossi's dance company performed a piece that incorporated the movement of Valorians, Kathrani, and humans, all dancing together in perfect harmony. Anvor came from Kethra specifically to be there. She spoke about her father's legacy, not as a great political leader, but as a bridge between worlds. She talked about how Kale's choice to stay on Earth, rather than return to Kethra, had proven to be the greatest contribution he could have made. By staying, he had kept the bridge alive. He had ensured that even as Kethra was being rebuilt, even as the Kathrani were returning to their own world, the connection between Earth and Kethra remained strong. My father understood something that took me years to fully grasp, Vor said at the funeral. He understood that home is not a place. Home is a connection. Home is understanding. Home is the willingness to stand between worlds and say, I belong here and there and everywhere. My father never set foot on the new Kethra, but his influence shaped every building, every street, every space where art is created there. Because he taught us that art is home. Creativity is home. The willingness to be vulnerable and authentic is home. And when you have that kind of home, no distance can ever separate you. 50 years after the Kathrani first arrived on Earth, the Kethra reconstruction project was officially completed. The world that had been destroyed was now not just restored but transformed. It had become a beacon of cultural innovation and artistic excellence. Beings from across the galaxy came to Kethra to study, to create, to heal. And the pattern that had begun in the human enclave in Northern California had spread throughout the galaxy. Every major civilization now had cultural centers based on the model that the Kathrani and humans had created together. Art and creativity were no longer seen as luxuries for the wealthy or as pastimes for the talented few. They were understood as fundamental needs, as essential as food or water or shelter. Therapists across the galaxy began prescribing art. Not instead of traditional medicine but alongside it. A person struggling with trauma was encouraged to paint, to dance, to write, to play music. A community recovering from conflict was supported in creating collaborative art projects. A civilization rebuilding after destruction, like Kethra, was designed around the principle that creativity was the foundation of everything. The Interstellar Arts and Healing Initiative, which had started as a small project run by Kale, had grown into a network that spanned hundreds of worlds and included millions of artists of every species. Its mission statement was simple: to heal what is broken through the power of creation, and to prove that beauty is the strongest force in the universe. But perhaps most importantly, the story of the Kathrani refugees became what beings across the galaxy called the greatest transformation. Not because the Kathrani had been the only species to suffer. There were dozens of conflicts, hundreds of tragic displacements happening throughout the galaxy. But because the Kathrani story showed that suffering did not have to lead to resentment, to endless cycles of conflict, or to despair. It could lead to creation. It could lead to beauty. It could lead to a deeper understanding of what it meant to be alive. Final scene, 75 years after the arrival. On a warm evening in the human enclave in Northern California, an old woman sat on the bridge where everything had begun. Her name was Sarah Reeves, and she was the great-great-granddaughter of Thomas Reeves. She was 93 years old, and she had spent her entire life making music. She sat on the bridge with her great-granddaughter, a young Kathrani human hybrid named Arya. Arya was 25 years old and was considered a prodigy, a musician who could play in both human and Kathrani styles, and who had created entirely new musical forms that blended the two. "This is where your ancestors sat," Arya said, looking out at the landscape. "This is where it all began." "Yes," Sarah said, and she pulled out her great-great-grandfather's guitar. It was worn, the wood aged to a deep gold, the strings replaced countless times over the decades, but the sound was still beautiful. "Will you play something?" Arya asked. Sarah smiled and began to play. The song was one that Thomas Reeves had written, but that generations of musicians had since adapted. It was called The Road Home, and it told the story of being lost and broken and finding your way back to wholeness through connection and creation. As Sarah played, Kathrani began to gather on the other side of the bridge, just as they had done 75 years before. But they were different now. They were not traumatized refugees seeking healing. They were artists and healers and creators and ordinary beings going about their lives, who had learned that art was part of life as natural as breathing. When Sarah finished the song, Arya picked up a Kathrani instrument, an ancient device that produced sound through quantum vibration, and they played together. Human guitar and Kathrani quantum instrument, blending in a way that would have been unimaginable 75 years before. A human child and a Kathrani elder stopped to listen. A Valorian energy being manifested nearby, adding its own unique sound to the music. A robot from a distant world, powered by artificial intelligence but capable of appreciating beauty, processed the music and somehow expressed its appreciation in a series of gentle beeps. And in that moment, on a bridge that had become sacred ground in the eyes of the galaxy, beings from different species, different worlds, different forms of consciousness came together to share in something that transcended all differences. They came together to create. They came together to heal. They came together to prove that the most powerful force in the universe was not military strength, not technological advancement, not political power. It was beauty. It was art. It was the human capacity, shared by countless species, to take what is broken and transform it into something that makes life worth living. The sun set over the bridge, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. And as it set, the music continued. It would continue into the night. It would continue tomorrow. It would continue for as long as there were beings willing to create, willing to heal, willing to say to their broken world, "We are still here. We are still capable of beauty. And that is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything."